When this elderly lady stumbled on a wild, hungry wolf while riding on the edge of the forest, she thought she would never see her house again. But then something amazing happened and changed the course of that fateful day. Juliana Kostoff was an eccentric elderly lady who had lived in her little town since she was about 50 years old. Pushing 80 now, she was no different from how she had always been. Some people in the town affectionately knew her as the crazy grandma. She was eccentric, for sure. No one could dispute that. She had simply rolled into town one day many years prior on her beautiful motorcycle and never left again. The town itself was ordinary enough. Everyone played their role in some way or another. Juliana was an herbalist. She had trained in her youth to heal with plants, and so that's the career she had pursued since. Having the forest nearby also helped immensely in her line of work, as she wouldn't have to venture far to harvest the plants she had cultivated herself. Skepticism aside, she was good at what she did. People would travel from neighboring towns for solutions to their health issues, many of which had exhausted the traditional healing methods. When Juliana wasn't healing the sick and wounded, she was painting or taking long rides on her motorcycle through the ever-winding roads around the mountains. To her, this was a type of meditation. It also helped her get to areas of the mountain where she hid some precious herbs. She had planted them high up, knowing the chances of a random bystander finding them would be minimal. It was through harvesting these herbs that she happened upon something that would change her life, though at the time, she didn't quite know it yet. It was a gloomy day. There was a lot of rain forecasted to pour down on the valley, so Juliana decided it would be a good time to go and harvest whatever had grown in the mountains. The last thing she needed was for the plants to wash away. She packed up her gear and set off on her motorcycle. It took about 15 minutes for her to make the ascent. She couldn't help but notice that the landscape seemed different. It looked as though a giant had swept through the area. Shrubbery and trees were flattened or destroyed in what seemed like a direct path down the mountain. The only possible culprit she could think of was an avalanche somewhere between that day and the day she had last gone up. A piece of rock must have shattered right off the cliff face and rolled down. Thankfully, she hadn't been there when it happened. When she got to her plants eventually, she was pleased to see them in good condition. She bent over and began harvesting the valuable herbs when all of a sudden, she heard something. It sounded like a cry, but from what, she couldn't quite tell. This forest was filled with wolves. While Juliana greatly respected the true owners of the land, she also feared them terribly. She wasn't exactly excited at the prospect of coming face to face with one, but the noise sounded more like a whimper than a growl, and she felt compelled to discover where it was coming from. She tentatively made her way towards the faint cry until it got louder and louder. She was now standing among big boulders and shattered rocks. She looked under the rubble and suddenly found herself staring into the eyes of a wolf cub. The poor thing had its leg pinned under a rock. It was crying away, probably for its mother, but she was nowhere to be seen. Juliana couldn't help but wonder if she had been a victim of the avalanche. Abandoning her plans for the plants, she set to work helping the poor little pup. It didn't take much for her to free the animal. However, he seemed to be in severe shock because he remained still throughout the process. Juliana couldn't release him back into the wilderness in those conditions and decided to take him home with her to guide him through his recovery. So, she picked him up and carried him back to her bike. She had no issue getting him home. The poor little thing hardly moved. He must have been stuck up there for quite some time. Juliana immediately started caring for the sweet pup, but first she gave him a name. Loki. His gray-black little face gave her the impression that he could get up to quite some mischief, if given the chance, just like the mythological god of the same name. Through her healing pastes, medicines, and some good old love, Loki was soon back to being completely healthy. So much so that he even began to howl in the evenings. Juliana knew this was his way to get back in touch with his wild side. Soon, he would be gone. She would be sad to see him leave, but that was how nature worked, and nobody knew it better than her. A couple of weeks passed, and as expected, Loki left Juliana's house one day and never returned. From that day on, Juliana would always wonder where Loki might be and what he might be getting up to. She even considered asking some of the local men to help her track him. That is, until one special night when she realized he'd never really left her side. It had been almost a year since she had last seen Loki. When she heard a loud howl nearby, something deep inside her told her it had to be her wolf friend. He must have returned from his adventures. She never actually saw him in the forest, but the howl was enough for her. Juliana, the crazy grandma, went back into her routine. She got busy again with patients and made sure to go on her daily rides as much as possible. And one day, she had a ride she would never forget. That morning, Juliana didn't have many patients booked. In fact, it was one of the quietest days she had seen to date. So she took advantage of the empty planner to take a longer ride than usual. She dared to go beyond her usual route and take one she had hardly traveled. The idea was simply exhilarating. Little did she know what was waiting her around the bend. She had been riding for almost an hour, twisting and turning around some new unexplored bends in the road. The scarf she had wrapped around her mouth had slowly been moving, awkwardly. So when she saw a straight stretch in the road, she decided to take advantage of it. She pulled over safely and began to fix her scarf. That's when disaster struck. Before she could even realize what had happened to her, Juliana found herself on the ground, facing one of the forest's most fearsome predators, a big, gray wolf. She had been knocked down from her bike by this fearsome creature. It was now standing over her, drooling and snarling in her face. It looked hungry and mean. All Juliana could think of was that it was over. It had to be over. There was no way she was going to come out of this alive. She closed her eyes, trying to avoid the snarling teeth in front of her, when suddenly she felt a whoosh of air past her. Something else was there. She slowly peeked open an eye. What she saw made her stomach fall even deeper. There was another big wolf in front of her, but then she looked again and noticed something. The big black and gray wolf that had just arrived was not looking at her, but rather at the wolf that had attacked her. It had its back to her, preventing the first wolf from getting any closer. The two animals were now snarling at each other. Juliana could hardly believe it. Were they fighting for the right to eat her? Then there was a loud growl and a lot of snarling as the wolves launched themselves at each other into a massive brawl. Juliana used this opportunity to get up and return to her bike. She had just reached it when she heard a loud squeal behind her and some scampering away. Curiosity won over fear, and she quickly turned to see what had happened. There stood an amazing sight she never thought she'd see again. It was Loki. He was much bigger now, all fully grown. He stood sheepishly waiting to be pet by Juliana. She could hardly believe it. After all this time, he had still been watching over her. In fact, he had just saved her life. She couldn't help but smile and think life was a full circle. She had saved Loki's life all those months prior, so he had done the same in return.